Jesus in that post.
No, absolutely not. I thought that was blasphemy. As a Christian, I was very offended. And a doctor, President Trump is not a doctor. And that picture had him in a robe, as Jesus is often portrayed, with light coming out of his hands. And he talked about healing people like a Red Cross worker. I think there would be many people that would argue with that, saving lives. So I think it was blasphemy. I was offended. I think he should apologize, not act defensive. And many Christians across America and the world were very offended by that.
I think the split between you and the president is well known now. Obviously, you've talked about the death threats you've gotten because of what he said about you and what has happened there. Some people might hear your answer there, though, and remember things that you have said about the president in the past, things like this.
President Trump is joining some of the most incredible people in history being arrested today. Nelson Mandela was arrested, served time in prison. Jesus was arrested and murdered by the Roman government.
When obviously you hear those comments that you said before, how would you respond to people who might say, well, comparisons like that are what led to the president posting what he did yesterday?
We're talking about people being prosecuted unfairly by weaponization of government, political prosecutions, things that happen, such as like the political protesters. That's what I was referring to there. I wasn't talking or President Trump trying to portray himself as Jesus. I think that was completely different. President Trump and I have had our differences on a few key issues. I'm not a Democrat at all, Caitlin, but we did have our disagreements on the Epstein files and the war in Iran. And I've always been very anti-war. That was under President Biden. I was anti-war, voted that way, voted against funding foreign wars such as Ukraine and aid to Israel. And I've also been very vocal about the Epstein files, which is what led to President Trump calling me a traitor, saying he would destroy me and run a primary opponent against me. So I think that's a completely different comparison.
And Congressman Khanna, when you look at this, that post came after the Pope had said that he wanted peace in Iran, peace in the world. The president obviously viewed that as criticism and said that he was weak on crime. Do you understand why the president is engaging in this attack on the Pope that he says he won't apologize for?
I find it sad. I mean, I respect Representative Green as a person of Christian faith. We don't agree on a lot of issues. We don't agree on abortion rights. We may not agree on everything related to gun violence, but she cares about the dignity of human beings. That's why she has spoken out against the president when he says, I want to wipe out Iranian civilization. That's what I'm concerned about more than a social media post. That's why we've spoken out for survivors. These aren't political issues. These are moral issues rooted in our Constitution, rooted in our faith traditions. And my concern with the president is he's not simply arguing ideology anymore. He's made this about a betrayal of fundamental values.
Yeah, that post last week got a lot more attention, where the president said a whole civilization will die tonight. And former Congresswoman Green, you posted about that after the president had made that threat. He went off on Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, several people who have been pretty big champions of his in the past. And he also went after you. You responded to that post about a whole civilization will die with, in all caps, 25th Amendment and 3 exclamation points. Do you really think that the president should be removed from office?
I think we have to truly question the mental stability of any president that threatens to wipe out an entire civilization of people. That would include all the innocent people in that country that have nothing to do with the war, especially after President Trump said this was about freeing the Iranian people from the Iranian regime. So for him to call to wipe out an entire civilization of people is absolutely wrong. But, here I want to talk tonight about the reason why we're having this discussion is Ro Khanna and I both are willing to say that the current center of right and left that have been coming together for decades have failed Americans. And Roe and I, just like he said, we're completely different. I'm unapologetically pro-life. I'm against the trans agenda on children. I'm against the Green New Deal. I'm for very secure borders and a strong economy and a smaller government. But the current center, right, and left that coalition in America have got us in $40 trillion in debt, have funded foreign war after foreign war after foreign war, and now funding another one, and they will be, and we don't know how long this will go. And it's gotten to a point where Americans can't afford life, Caitlin. And so Roe and I, we exchanged comments on social media saying that we recognize how hard for the left and the right to come together and find issues that we can work together on. But Roe and I did that on the Epstein files, and it was incredibly important. And there's also issues such as